Okay, good morning, and welcome back to our morning session on empowerment in the household. I just experienced something highly embarrassing, but I have to use it as an illustration of kind of ingrained norms that affect gender dynamics. I just was going towards the restroom, and I assumed that the longer line was for the women's room. And I bypassed 4 women and walked right into their bathroom. And fortunately, it was empty. Otherwise, it would have been even more embarrassing. Good food for thought for the session today. So my name is Arjit Nandi. I'm an epidemiologist here at the Institute for Health and Social Policy in the Department of Epi at McGill. And as a social epidemiologist, we've been kind of inundated with lots of different types of multi-level and hierarchical models over the years. And so I'm going to kind of pass that on to you as a general reflection and motivation for the panel, but also for the discussion afterwards. One of the things that I've kind of noted is these different levels of scale that we've been talking about. Many of you probably noticed the same thing. I'll probably offend some economists by saying it's kind of a micro-macro sort of distinction. On the macro side, I see this more as thinking about policymakers as the prime targets, thinking about public policies as the prime types of interventions. And in some ways, I would argue that actually the strategy and the potential solutions seem more well-defined. I wouldn't say that there's necessarily better evidence for their impact, but maybe more well-defined interventions. When we think about public policies that affect education or the economy or the social determinants or public health and family planning and sexual and reproductive health, for example. And there seems to be a clear strategy there. At least in the last few years, we've seen a strategy which seems to be targeting policymakers by saying, if we can encourage women's economic participation, women's participation in the labor force parity between the genders, in those places where we have the worst indicators in terms of women's empowerment, we might see the greatest economic growth. And I can see that being a compelling argument. Whether it's going to be impactful or not, I think is a separate question. And on the other scale of this hierarchy, I think when we go down to the household level, which is going to be the topic of conversation today, I would say that there are actually more question marks as far as what that strategy and what those interventions might be. And I think hopefully we'll get some more insights and some more answers to those questions today. But I think it's a question about whether those more macro level policies at scale will eventually reach the household level and affect dynamics. So when we think about an education policy that promotes equal participation in primary and secondary school, will that eventually lead to older age of marriage and first birth and empowerment over generations? But we can also think about more local level interventions. And I think we've talked about a lot of those so far this morning, and we'll hear about some more of them now, that directly target household dynamics. And I think there are a lot of open questions about what the impact of those are. Are they positive? Are they null? Are they in some cases negative? Because there's, of course, been anecdotal evidence, but also evidence in literature of some perverse effects of these types of interventions. What is the time frame? I'm glad that people have been talking about time frame for these types of interventions. I've mentioned that in many cases for public policy, we might expect these things to be transmitted over many years, if not generations. So what is the time frame for these types of interventions to have an effect? We've talked about scalability and had some interesting discussion about that for the last session. To what extent can we think about transporting them and generalizing them? To what extent must they be adapted? Getting to Marcus's point in the last panel. So I think these are some of the simple questions for the panel to confront for today's session. So we're joined by 3 very distinguished speakers. It's a real honor to be chairing this panel. Professors Quisumbing, McDougal, and Anderson. So the first speaker will be Dr. Quisumbing from IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, who will be followed by Dr. McDougal from UC San Diego School of Medicine, and Dr. Siwan Anderson from UBC, Department of Economics. So, Dr. Quisumbing.
Can I just use enter?
Yeah, just the right.
Okay, great. Thank you very much to the organizers of this conference. Sonia and Kate have done such an incredible job bringing all of us together. So when I was asked to participate in this panel on empowerment within the household, it made me reflect on the inter-household research that we have done at IFPRI. So for those of you who don't know what IFPRI is, it's the International Food Policy Research Institute. It's one of 15 international agricultural research centers around the world. We work on evidence-based and sustainable policy solutions to hunger and malnutrition, to poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. So as I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking about what brought me to IFPRI years ago. So I've been at IFPRI since 1995, so a very long time. And at that time, the work on testing models of household behavior had just begun. And a lot of the findings from that work influenced the design of programs that targeted resources to particular people within the household. So in particular, the conditional cash transfer programs. The impact evaluation of those programs, in turn, led to a lot of new theoretical developments on how households behave, and these, in turn, led to other data being collected. So, in a sense, this whole area of work is an interaction between evidence, action and evidence. It's very interactive. It's certainly not a static field of work. So today I'm going to talk about some ongoing work, actually mostly ongoing work with Cheryl Dawes, who's at Oxford, Ruth Meinsendick and Hazel Malapit at IFPRI, and part of our work in the Gender, Agriculture, and Access Project Phase 2. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of concepts and models. Those of you who are economists can take a nap during that time. It's going to be a short nap. And then I'm going to talk about what the data tell us about gender gaps in control and ownership of resources, and also what they reveal about jointness. This helps us to challenge our concepts because we don't really know very much about how to think about jointness in household behavior, and what do the data tell us about the resources that men and women control, whether solely or jointly. And then I'm going to go into measurement. Why does it matter in terms of measuring empowerment within a household that we consider both sole and joint decision-making over resources? And finally, I'm going to end with why does it matter for programs and policy? So your nap can begin now. So previously, economists believed that households behave as if there was one decision maker, all resources were pooled. This was then challenged by the work of Chiappori and other people on a collective model of the household, where the households actually have multiple decision makers with different preferences. We don't assume a single household welfare index or utility function. Now, much of this literature uses a game theoretic framework, assumes that the household will reach an efficient outcome, and assumptions that preferences differ by gender allow tests of how men's and women's bargaining power affects outcomes. So a lot of the early work on inter-household allocation evolved tests of how women's and men's bargaining power, measured in various ways, affected outcomes that we were interested in. What is actually key in a lot of these bargaining models is individual control of resources, whether it's formulated in terms of a cooperative bargaining model or a non-cooperative bargaining model. In the cooperative bargaining model, each individual has an outside option or a threat point, and individuals must obtain at least their outside option or their leave. So this could be divorce, desertion, or just opting out of pooling resources and making joint decisions. Burnt toast and cold conversations, or non-conversations. For non-cooperative bargaining models, we don't assume resources are pooled. We allow for outcomes where there's strategic behavior and where potential gains from cooperation are not realized. Now, what's key here is that because threat points are formulated as individual threat points, and they often focus on individually consumed goods or leisure, it doesn't really lead to a lot of thinking about joint production or consumption of the public good. But in reality, there is a lot of jointness in life. Households form because of public goods and economies of scale in household production. They also form to share risk, to have and raise children, and for social reasons, for companionship. So the reality is that all over the world, in the area in which I work, men and women work together on family farms. Even if some plots are solely managed by the man or the woman, there is often joint production. Family members often work on each other's plots. And in reality, children are often, though not always, raised jointly by their parents or by other groups of social beings or human beings. So what's the data tell us? Colleagues and Cheryl and various other colleagues and I have looked at the agricultural land data from the LSMS ISA, as well as other nationally representative data. So in Africa, so the key here is the blue is land held or controlled by women. The brown, I don't know, well, it looks brown here, but actually it's red. So it's blue, red, and yellow. So even if in both our sub-Saharan Africa and Asian countries, the lion's share of land, of agricultural land area is held by men, there is quite a lot of joint land, joint agriculture land, there's a lot of agricultural land which is held by both. So this is quite, it's sizable in Africa. There is quite a bit of it in Vietnam where there was a joint titling program. There's less in Bangladesh, Timor-Leste, and Tajikistan. But the point is that if we don't take this into account and only focus at men's and women's individually owned land holdings, or owned or controlled land holdings, we're missing a part of the picture. The extent of jointness is more when you look at assets. So this is data from the Gender Asset Gap Project, which Cheryl and Carmen Diana Deer and Karen Groen and colleagues undertook. And if you're going to take a look at the share of assets held by women, men, and jointly by both, so the blue categories for individual women, the red categories individual man. There is a category for the couple, that's yellow, green for household, and then sort of the orangey thing is other. So it actually differs quite a lot depending on what asset you're looking at. In terms of the principal residence, in both Karnataka, in India and Ghana, men have a larger share of the principal residence, but that's different in Ecuador. In Ecuador, you actually have the couple account, what they say the couple holds the individual residence. And in terms of livestock, it differs depending on their large livestock or small livestock. And I don't have a slide here on poultry, and there's quite a lot of female ownership of poultry. So how does considering jointness matter when we try to measure empowerment? So in the bargaining models that I talked about earlier, these are often formulated in reference to individual resource and threat points, but women may value the power derived from joint ownership and control of assets as well. We did a lot of field work, pre-testing of our questionnaires, as well as qualitative work, and we came across this question: is it better to have sole ownership of a minor asset or joint ownership of a major asset? So I remember that discussion yesterday. Let's empower a woman by giving her a chicken or a sewing machine. Is it enough? Is it more significant for her to have sole control of that chicken or joint control of a major asset in the household, such as land or the house or a business enterprise? And in different cultures, women may feel more empowered by their contribution to a collective good, but in others by their individual control of resources. So as we were developing the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, which I'll talk about in a bit, and we did these case studies of women in our pilot areas, we found, for example, in Bangladesh, that women valued their contribution to the collective, whereas in Uganda, it was that they were able to stand by themselves and make decisions by themselves. So it's very different and also quite contextual. So in the effort to develop measures or metrics of women's empowerment, I was involved, I'm one of the co-developers of the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, which is made up of two sub-indices. One is the 5 domains of empowerment, which is a direct measure of women's empowerment in 5 dimensions. And the other one's a gender parity index, which is women's achievements relative to the primary male in her household. The key thing in the WEA, a very unpronounceable name, is that we collect the same information within the household from both the primary male and the primary female. So it's a survey-based index. We can't construct it from existing data. You really have to do the survey yourself. So it was inspired by Nyla's definition of empowerment to focus on resources, agency, and achievements. We focus more on resources and agency. The index components were designed to be applicable across countries and cultures, of course with adaptation. Men and women from the same household are interviewed. The survey questionnaire modules focus on men's and women's empowerment in agriculture. That's the original way, although we are developing others to look at value chains and employment. And it applies to women in households with male adults, as well as those with only female adults. So it's dual-headed as well as female-headed households. But in all the measures of decision-making, power, autonomy, and control, we consider both sole or joint decision-making, not just sole decision-making, ownership, and control. Because when we look at the data, very, very few women report having sole control, decision-making, ownership of anything. But there is quite a lot of jointness. And as we went to the field, we began to appreciate that they actually valued this jointness. So there are 10 indicators over 5 domains, and I'm not going to go into all of these. These are all on the IFPRI website. But the key thing here is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, most of the ownership and decision-making indicators take into account sole or joint ownership or decision-making. So whether they're in production, resources, control of income, leadership, and time. So the way it was rolled out by the Feed the Future initiative, and it was applied to all 19 Feed the Future countries. These are only 13 countries. But what we found useful from collecting the WEA is that it enables us to diagnose sources of this empowerment, because the index is an additive and decomposable index. This work was led by, the index part was led by the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, and they do multidimensional poverty indices. And the reason that we did this is that we recognize that empowerment is a multidimensional concept. So these diagnostics have actually been quite useful for policymakers. We identified, for example, that lack of access or control over credit, workload, and group membership are the most important constraints across countries. These show the women's scores, these empowerment scores, but we also have them for men. So why does it matter for programs and policy? One is that if we focus only on changes in household outcomes, we may miss inter-household impact. So for example, the quite famous BRAC Targeting the Ultra-Poor program, which transferred livestock as well as livestock assets as well as provided training to women, the earlier studies focus on household income and assets, and it was fantastic. It is a fantastic program. When we went back and looked at the inter-household impacts, we found out that although the woman retained control of the transferred asset, the additional income from that asset was often used to purchase things which the man controlled. But that said, she still felt that she contributed to the household and that her, that her social standing increased because the household as a whole benefited. Secondly, if we focus only on individual outcomes, we may miss out on changes in those joint or collective outcomes, and that's what the example I gave, that if you only look at men's and versus women's assets, men might have increased their control of other assets, but there was still that sense of contributing to the welfare of the collective. But the thing is, we may also miss out on opportunities to achieve development outcomes by designing programs that recognizes both individual and joint incentives. So IFPRI is now midway through a research program that's looking at the impact of agricultural development programs on women's empowerment. So this is a set of 13 agricultural development projects in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. It's supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We're working with agricultural development projects to adapt the WEA for project use. Projects were invited to submit applications for participation in the portfolio depending on their commodity focus or objective. And similar to the original WEA, the project WEA is being designed to take both sole and joint decision-making into account. So All the projects have experimental or quasi-experimental designs. Some of them use an RCT, some of them use matching methods to create a counterfactual. Some have joined the project without a real impact evaluation design, so just using DID. And others are using a random encouragement design. So the funding we provided to these projects was in additional to what they were already doing in terms of the impact evaluation. And very importantly, all projects are undertaking complementary qualitative work to understand what empowerment means within each of the project contexts. So I want to talk about actually 2 projects which are in our portfolio. And basically, it's a way of thinking about how you can design a nutrition-sensitive agricultural program with jointness in mind. So there are 2 RCTs with qualitative components. Both of them are in Bangladesh with different implementation agencies. So one called TRAIN is called Targeting and Realigning Agriculture to Improve Nutrition. The implementing agency is BRAC, possibly the world's largest NGO. And the other one is ANGEL, Agriculture, Nutrition, and Gender Linkages in Bangladesh, which is being implemented by the Ministry of Agriculture with HKI providing technical support, Helen Kellen International. These studies have IFPRI as evaluation partner, and they were designed to be quite similar. I call them the twins separated at birth studies, because one is being implemented by government and the other one by NGO. Both projects are similar, so I'm only going to talk about TRAIN. The primary outcomes are maternal dietary diversity and maternal BMI, plus a number of secondary outcomes related to women's, men's, and children's nutrition, as well as women's empowerment. So the evaluation questions basically are as follows. Our base program is a credit program, an agricultural credit program targeted to women. If we add a BCC to that, does it enhance the impacts on maternal and child nutrition and women's empowerment? Layered onto that, what if we add agricultural extension services targeted to men and women? This is actually quite, I wouldn't even say revolutionary, but quite innovative in the context of Bangladesh, where agricultural extension services are typically given only to men. Then what if we add a BCC program aimed at improving maternal and child nutrition on top of the ag extension services? And finally, what if we add a male sensitization and social mobilization component in addition? So it's an RCT with 1 comparison and 3 treatment arms. The base arm is, the treatment arm is the microcredit program. Group 2 has a credit program plus BCC. Group 3 has BCC plus the ag extension, and the last group has BCC, ag extension, plus gender sensitization. So we have just finished the baseline. The end line is going to be next year. We finished baseline last year. So it's going to be like 2 years in implementation. Okay. So before I get the nasty reminder that I'm supposed to conclude, so I was trying to really get at where we came from, who we are, and where we are going. Our starting point was a unitary model of the household, and then we moved to the collective model. But as we moved to the collective model, I believe that we focus too much on individual decision-making and control, and not on what's actually going on in the household, where there is both cooperation and conflict. Who are we? We are social beings. Household members do come together to produce and consume jointly. The extent of jointness varies, but there is quite a lot of jointness. So we need to understand which resources are shared and what sharing means in different social and cultural contexts. We need to better understand the decision-making processes, as in when we're gathering data, when we need information from both spouses, and how do we categorize a range of decision-making processes that involve different levels of input and final control from various household members. Those of us in the room who have done household surveys knows that the categorical joint is a very murky category. What does it really mean? That really deserves to be unpacked. Finally, and I think this is an area where many people yesterday and today have alluded to, we don't really understand very well the relationship between individual empowerment and collective empowerment. A lot of our indicators of empowerment are down at the individual level, but we also know that women are empowered when they are in a group. So, for example, all the work on self-help groups, for example, group-based programs. This is, I think, a very promising area of research, and I think that as we try to link better the individual and the collective, we'll have a lot of scope for research as well as for action. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bonjour à tous. Merci pour votre accueil. So I'm here representing the Center on Gender Equity and Health at the University of California, San Diego. We are a research group that focuses on the equitable treatment of women and girls for the purpose of improving their health. And in the context of this panel on household decision-making, I'd like to step outside the box of the usual suspects of household decision-making a little bit. So the ones that we see on surveys all of the time. Who makes decisions on major household purchases? Who decides about your own health care, your children's health care? What's your agency with regards to mobility? And challenge us to think about that in terms of other realms of empowerment, specifically early marriage. So early marriage is a focal point of some of the SDGs. It has its own target, it has its own indicators. But when we talk about it as the outcome number. There's 40% child marriage in this country, 27% in this country. Those outcome numbers are actually the end result of a very long and complex, in some cases, process of decision-making that I think we need to unpack, to the theme of this conference, a little bit more to understand where we are going with those decisions and how to best intervene in those areas. So to that end, I'm going to be presenting some qualitative data, which is not, I'm a quantitative researcher, but I'm qualitative for today, from Ethiopia and from India. We're in the Oromia region of Ethiopia and Jharkhand region of India. And this is data taken from two programs supported by the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. They have the same goal of promoting adolescent sexual and reproductive health and delaying first marriage for girls. They have slightly different programmatic foci within their context. So the Ethiopian program does a little bit more work on financial literacy for girls. The Indian program has more creative delivery modalities with street theater and drama, but they have the same overarching goal. You can see that the settings are a little bit different, but they both have relatively young age at first marriage. So this data is drawn from a qualitative assessment. Data was collected in 2014, and for those of you who've done qualitative research and are doing some quick mental math right now, you can see that this is a very large sample. We had 205 individuals interviewed, doing semi-structured, in-depth interviews. And the data, they have kind of an interesting structure. So the girls had all participated in these programs that were run in Ethiopia and India. Some of them, they all received proposals of marriage before the age of 18. Some of them ended up being married before the age of 18, and some of them delayed or canceled those early marriage proposals. In each of those buckets, girls were asked to identify up to 3 key decision makers who informed that process. So both the girls and their decision makers were interviewed about the entire early marriage decision-making process. We used a latent content analysis approach to look at this. And I won't go into the details of the framework that we used to inform this coding, but it has a lot of the same themes that we have seen talked about both yesterday and today in terms of empowerment. So those underlying stressors that impact decision-making processes, we were looking, including some insight into resilience, the concept of psychological resilience. We were looking at things like self-efficacy, esteem, aspirations, social resources and supports, which you'll hear a lot about as I continue on. The steps of decision-making, specifically choice, voice, and agency, and then the final outcome. So it will probably not surprise many of you to learn that there were three main buckets that went into this early marriage decision-making process. The initiation stage, where the proposal was first brought to the girl or the girl's family or both. The negotiation stage, in which the merits of that proposal were discussed with various actors. And then the final decision-making. And in each stage, there were proponents and opponents. And the diversity of actors at each of these stages was one of the most interesting things that we found, and I will talk through each of these stages in brief. So it's qualitative, so my results are not tables. They're in the voice of the interviewees, but I won't read the quotes. I'll just leave them up there for those of you who are interested in hearing what some of these girls are saying for themselves and their decision makers. The initiation stage in these contexts was almost always initiated external to the nuclear family and directed at the girl's parents. The girl herself was very, very rarely involved in these stages. It was very deeply rooted in cultural traditions, and there were examples of social pressures, such as from the girl's uncle in the first of these quotes, and social pulls at play. We found that in most cases, parents were looking to have the best outcome for their daughters that they could. There was no intent to do harm here. The parents were looking for a good match, and what that meant differed across contexts and families. But some of the things that people talked about were a partner who was of a similar religious or ethnic group, who had a similar or higher social status, who didn't abuse alcohol or drugs. So there's a lot of screening that was going on at the parental level here. The effectiveness of the girl's voice in these situations, and particularly at the initiation stage, was very situational. These more traditionally oriented marriages were coming from somebody external to the family and directed at the girl's parents. And more often than not, the girl either had no idea that the proposal had been made or was completely excluded at this stage. So she may have had all of the empowerment in the world, but she didn't know that this was even going on. This is something that is happening at the level of her parents and other decision makers in the household. The negotiation stage was a very interesting one because we found that this was most porous to external influences. So we made a map, and I don't have it in here, but we made a map of the different actors that were involved at each of these stages. And it's pretty small at the initiation stage. The decision-making stage at the end was very small, but negotiation was really fairly broad. And this is where the impact of external influences, in these cases, again, this data was drawn from early marriage prevention programs and sexual and reproductive health programs. So we found that the program staff themselves were able to be a lever in these negotiation discussions, and that they were particularly well suited for this job because, of course, of their training in these programs. They were placed within the communities, they were from the communities, and they had all of the information that the programs had provided that they were using in their discussions with the girls. These external influences also had the benefit of defraying some of the adverse social repercussions that families talked of being fearful of when they themselves were interested in declining a proposal. There is a lot of stigma associated for a family in saying no to a proposal that was brought. They were worried both about what their community would think about the potential groom's family and whether they would have repercussions themselves for having said no to this proposal and wondering why that was. They also worried, what would the next proposal be? Would there be something else coming for their daughters? Would it be as good as this one? And having an external resource available to insert themselves into the situation was able to eschew some of those cultural norms that really, really heavily underscored these decision-making processes. That said, the role of the external influencer was neither easy nor universally beneficial. There were some families, including those who did not want their daughters to be married, who said, somebody outside of my family has no role in speaking for me. They should not have a part in this process. And so in some cases, they took it on themselves to say that this is not something that we want to move forward with. And in some cases, they did move forward themselves. And you can see in these quotes that there was tremendous perseverance used by some of these external influencers. But again, the degree of impact that that actually had in each of these decision-making processes was very unique. The influencer that had the most impact outside of external to the family influences was actually the father. And the father was one of probably the most important player throughout this process. And it was the father's valuation of the girls themselves and their valuation of girls' continued education that was the reason most frequently used in these negotiations as a means of pushing back a potential proposal. And that seemed to be slightly less incendiary in being used as a tool to delay marriage when a father was able to say, I need my daughter to complete school. She has several more years. And so it's not a commentary on your family or your child, but it's my own daughter's educational needs. We found that the area where girls' voice and agency was most apparent in these decision-making processes was actually in groom-initiated proposals. So the vast majority of these proposals followed a more traditional circumstance where they were initiated external to the family. They were dealt with mostly at the parental level. There was, however, a second stream of decision-making in which a groom directly approached an underage girl and suggested marriage to her. And it was in these couple-level negotiations that the girls were able to most effectively use their voice. This was interesting in a number of ways, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it became clear through these interviews that girls were very aware that their parents had an idea of what a good match was for them, and that maintaining these negotiations at the level of the couple was a way to circumvent that parental intervention in their decision. So any of you who have adolescent children or who are friends with adolescents know that they really like being in control of their decisions, and neurologically, their executive decision-making functions are not fully developed. And this is a big challenge when we're talking about adolescent girl empowerment, because we can empower these girls, and that means letting them make a decision. And it may mean that it's not the decision that we think is the right decision or the decision that we want them to have. And that's something that did come out in these interviews. The final decision-making was almost always done by the parents, particularly by the father. When mothers were the final decision-makers, it usually still involved convincing the fathers that it was a good idea to move forward with their belief. Mothers' rationales tended to be more related to reducing household burden once the daughter had married, and fathers' rationales tend to focus more on the girl herself. The justifications that parents used, as I said, most often were that of a good match and fear of no future marital prospects. And those unlucky unmarried female relatives in the family were used as an example of what could happen if this wasn't something that the family moved forward with at this point. Girls generally acquiesced to their parents' decisions. This was the vast majority of these 205 interviews that we looked at. These girls really had limited agency in traditional pathways. Again, at the initiation stage, they, more often than not, were not aware that a proposal had been brought forward. But throughout the decision-making process, they often were made aware of these early marriages only at the very end. And so when we think about the implications of this, if somebody is being told, and in this case it was the groom as well, on their wedding day, that it's time for an early marriage, the opportunity for intervention, voice, choice, and agency are very much compromised. Final decision-making was held by the girls in that couple-level decision-making pathway, where they, in large part, were, that decision-making was exercised without parental consent. These were, in India, they called them love marriages a lot. They called them more often elopements in India, where the teens self-selected each other. This was the most direct demonstration of agency seen in marital decision-making, and again, in some cases, it was implemented explicitly to circumvent parental selection of partners. This was also the level where peer pressure was most visible in these decision-making pathways. So as opposed to the more traditional parental level decision-making pathways where there were other family members and community members, for the adolescent decision-making pathways, it was both the girls and the potential groom's peers who were exerting pressure, depending on their allegiance, to move forward with or postpone these early marriages. Very rarely, but in some cases, there were threats, very serious threats made by the girls as to what the consequences would be if they weren't allowed to exercise their agency and their decision-making pathway. And again, as we think about this in the context of women's empowerment, this is a very difficult position for a parent to find themselves in. They want to support their daughter. They've been told by the programs that they're involved in that delaying marriage until 18 or later is one of the most important things that they can do to support their adolescent girls. And the adolescent girl is taking a relatively extreme stance in saying that this is my decision and I am going to move forward with this. So across these decision-making pathways, context, as we've heard throughout this conference and elsewhere, was extremely important. Social norms really heavily influenced marital expectations. We saw in some girls' cases that the loss of a parent really exacerbated the risk for early marriage, particularly the loss of a father. And in some cases, girls identified the need to get married so that there was a male head of household in their family. So it was acting as a protective agent for their natal family. We also found that legal sanctions in these settings for the girls that were interviewed bore relatively little cost relative to social sanctions. People were, for the most part, aware of laws regarding early marriage, and they were also aware of ways to circumvent those laws and felt that the social repercussions were more serious and more impactful in these decision-making pathways. So again, we had these two main streams of early marriage decision-making. The top stream was by far the most common, this elder and other family initiated pathway, moving through family negotiations and largely the father's decision. The girls throughout these pathways really had limited opportunities to exercise their own voice, choice, and agency themselves. Their interests were mostly represented by proxy, often by their fathers in these decision-making pathways. And so having parents who believed one way or the other in these, the early marriage decision-making generally made the decision as to what would happen in these courses. The girls had very little opportunity to change them themselves. The couple-level negotiations were, again, where these, the voice, choice, and agency of these girls were most apparent. They didn't all end in early marriage. There were cases in which the girl exercised agency, and in some cases, she actually went and brought in an external influence herself, when her voice was not enough to stop the groom from persisting. But there were also cases where it was the girl's decision to move forward with these early marriages. So these pathways were really populated by many, many players. And in the absence of agency, it was very difficult for the girls to have a direct impact on these early marriage prevention pathways. The enabling environments for adolescent girls were important, but they were mostly manifested in terms of social support from key decision makers in their lives, primarily fathers and program staff in these settings. Girls that had agency really had a strong desire to retain decision making at their own level for couple-initiated marriage proposals, and they were somewhat more vulnerable to peer pressure without adult intervention. Again, these are teenagers, and their friends are telling them you should or you shouldn't get married, and they're not talking to the adults in their lives about it. So they don't have the opportunity to benefit from those perspectives. So Where do these findings leave us? This is not an impact evaluation. This is not a representative sample. This is qualitative data drawn from a program sample in 2 settings. What we did find, though, is that for these girls, in terms of moving forward with changing program directions, interventions that target only one player or one pathway are probably going to leave some girls out. And when we're talking about reducing child marriage as a sustainable development goal statistic, it's going to need to be a multi-pronged approach to this. These marital initiation discussions were very, very deeply rooted in cultural tradition, and norms change. It's not news, but it's something that's really important in these areas. And this is an area where a direct incentivization approach, like a cash transfer, may not have a long-term impact in terms of actually changing these norms. Naila referred yesterday to some of the results from the Zomba trial in Malawi, where it looked great while it was going on, and then a few years after the program, it just wasn't sustained. The negotiation phase of early marriage was particularly open to external influence, and this was a unique data set in that it was drawn from an early marriage prevention program, and so we had these advocates built into the program. But participants really did discuss the benefit of having somebody outside of these traditional pathways who could come in and, without the burden of all of those cultural norms and expectations, suggest some other possible opportunities for these families. These marginalized girls that we saw, those who were particularly poor, particularly rural residing, or who had lost a parent, were incredibly vulnerable. And in many cases, their early marriage, from their family's perspective, changed them from a liability to a resource. And that's something that programs need to consider in these settings. As we move towards early prevention, early marriage prevention, everyone agrees that that's a good idea. But contextually, it may not be the most apparent locally beneficial strategy. And so that's something that we need to discuss and figure out in these settings. Empowerment of girls is really important. Nobody's saying that it's not important. But when you empower somebody in a setting where they don't know what's about to happen to them until it actually happens, the effectiveness of that approach is, of course, limited. Finally, parents, as the final decision makers, should be involved in these early marriage prevention programs. They often are. I will say that we should probably involve the mothers and the fathers, because they didn't always agree with each other, and they talked a lot about the power struggles between them there, and that having both involved and having those conversations in a safe and education-oriented space is likely to better inform these parents who, in many cases, served as the proxy for their daughter's voice in these negotiation discussions. So with that, I'll thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to mainly talk about research that I've been involved in, and more from a conceptual framework. So I'm sort of a development economist who does sort of more of the theoretical backdrops to these concepts and also looks at survey data. I'm not a RCT development economist. I'm probably the only one in the world at this point, but well, I still remain. And just, I mean, everyone in this room is very familiar that this has been empowerment's been on the agenda, the policy agenda, since around the early 80s, and it's been a primary. I mean, everyone in this room knows it's been a primary policy goal. But the reason isn't just because we should treat women on equal par with men, but actually we think from a development perspective, from even an economic development perspective, investing in women or improving their empowerment is good. And primarily that's through this notion of these household framework that Agnes has talked about, is that if we put money or resources in the hands of women versus men, they spend it on different things. And in particular, they spend it on child outcomes. And we think investing in children is one of the most important things for long-term development. And this is sort of turned into these Millennium Development Goals and so forth that really think investing in female empowerment will lead to outcomes that combat poverty and so forth. And this thinking really comes from this household framework that Agnes referred to that I'll talk a little bit more to. And since this has been on the policy agenda, we've had big, huge improvements, unprecedented changes in women's rights, education, health, access to opportunities, and so forth. And more countries than ever guarantee women, equal rights in terms of the law. But of course, as everyone in this room knows, women and girls continue to suffer discrimination and violence in all parts of the developing world and at all stages of their life. And sort of this idea of thinking about empowerment within the household, I think, can't be overemphasized enough, partly because, as Lotus has already referred to a bit, is that marriage is absolutely universal in developing countries. Women depend, essentially on their father in childhood and then their husband in marriage for livelihood. Often, marriage is often the most important stage of a woman's life, and it happens at a relatively young age. Just to give you, so this is data from the GID Gender and Institutions database that was mentioned yesterday, and I fully fully respect that notions of empowerment are very context specific, but I also think that we can learn a lot from trying to understand these regional differences. And this is just to give you a sense of these discriminatory indicators within marriage. So the one first is the early marriage, which is exactly what Lotus is talking about. So before age 18, you can see it's a third of women in Central Africa and a quarter in South Asia. And then Central America comes up too, which isn't a focus often as much in the debate. And then these last two columns are violence. So whether they think violence is justified in certain contexts. And the fourth column is whether they've actually experienced domestic violence within their marriage. And you can see it's as much as 60% in places in Central Africa. Often South Asia is pulled out as, where it happens the most. People focus a lot of research on that, but Africa is very, it has alarming numbers. And then the violence attitudes is whether women think it's justified that they're actually beaten by their husband. And again, you can see these are huge numbers. Again, close to 60, or more than 60% in Central Africa and West Africa and so forth. And then this other column, the second column, is whether they actually have rights to leave these, violent marriages. So these are these very interesting indexes they compute. So this is relative to a man. What is the power a woman has to initiate divorce legally? So 0 would be they have the same rights to a man to initiate divorce. 1 would be they have absolutely no rights. And these include sort of legal statutory law as well as customary law, and try and incorporate social norms and so forth and create these indexes between 0 and 1. So you see in West Asia, they have absolutely no rights at all. Very, very high in North Africa, but it's still very high. And the only place in the developing world where they have equal ability to do this is in Central South America, Caribbean. And then of course, people talk about we've made big leaps and bounds in terms of their legal rights, but you can see these are now, whether they are protected by law, by violence, rape, or harassment, the last three columns, and these first two columns are whether they have the equal rights to inherit for boys versus girls. So again, 1 means no rights at all, and 0 means similar rights. And again, these nowhere in the world are they legally protected, right? Essentially, even where we think, Caribbean, Central America, South America, nowhere. Things are particularly stark in Africa, parts of Africa, and West Asia as well. Very few rights. So things are not, we still need a lot to do with regards to within the household and within marriage. So as Agnes alluded to, how we conceptually think about it is how their negotiation plays out within the household, right? So this process, and Agnes is talking very interestingly about this sort of joint processes which we have a very little modeling of and conceptual work of. And then we think of what determines their ability to negotiate within the household is determined by anything that's determined outside that household, outside of marriage. So this includes the work opportunities that were talked about earlier today, collective action, sort of even self-help groups, that kind of thing, and then all the overarching non-discriminatory laws and cultural norms. But again, we want to see how those impact the negotiation within the household. So as Agnes has already alluded to, all these transfer programs and all these microcredit programs targeted at women are assuming women are not powerless, right? They're not powerless within these households. Otherwise, it would have absolutely no impact to give women the money. And alternatively, if households were completely harmonious, so men and women agreed on everything, they did things jointly and so forth, again, they would have no impact, right? There would be no reason to give it to a woman versus a man. So in practice, of course, we're in between, and this is what Agnes referred to, and also we have proven that empirically many times now. So, they're neither ruled by a dictator, the husband is not a pure dictator, and they're also not without discord. Everyone has different preferences over how many children to have, what they want to spend their income on, and so forth. And how we really think about their weight in the decision-making is this sort of outside bargaining power. So then the question is what determines that bargaining power, and how we typically measure this, which both speakers alluded to, which I'm gathering. I look forward to Agnes's new index of how we move away from measuring the autonomy or the decision-making in the household. The standard question is really this. Who usually decides about X? And the answers can be respondent, husband, and respondent and husband jointly. And I agree with, I can't remember if Lotus or Agnes said it, but essentially respondent, husband jointly does come up a lot. But still, the statistics on the husband sole one are still the majority answer in almost all these countries. And then you have various possibilities. So essentially, we think of, within the household, how we define. I don't know. I think people in this room think much more about how to conceptualize and how to define these notions. I sort of think about it as their relative decision-making choices relative to their husband. And we have strong, I won't go over this again, but we have strong empirical support now for this, okay? So then, for what work that I originally did on this was trying to understand, so this is getting back more conceptually, was, okay, we know that there's certain things, we think things that empower women outside the household, they're going to improve her bargaining power within the household, but are there some components that matter more? Okay, so this was the first paper investigating, is it possible these different factors have different possibilities? So then we think about it conceptually and empirically. Our context in this case is rural Bangladesh. And here the divorce is uncommon. Okay, so it's not a possible threat to say, I want to be treated better in the household and then I'm leaving the household. It just absolutely doesn't happen in this society. So instead of when other models cater to this, we think of the threat situation as cooperation essentially breaks down. Okay, so there's some way and this is where all this joint thinking will come in these kind of models. So essentially, then we can think about, if you think about that carefully, so you're deciding, who's good, you're doing sort of time use, spending allocations, who's going to have more weight. What you can show is actually that access to labor will have a much more important role than access to unearned income or access to assets, essentially, because what a woman can do is if she has actually wage labor to go to, she can credibly threaten that she's going to withdraw something within the household. Okay, so this sort of showed you that labor income facilitated greater autonomy than equivalent non-labor income. And alternatively, also bargaining framework, what it tells you is it's not equivalent to work on a family farm. Okay, so if you're just working with your husband, this is again what will come up with Agnes's future work. It doesn't improve her threat option if she doesn't have any way to gain wage labor outside the household. So it's not just that she's involved in an income earning, generating activity like family household farm, that won't actually increase her relative bargaining power. Okay, so this sort of work showed that first earned income is more important than unearned income, and secondly wage labor is more important than family labor, and controlling income mattered crucially. So aside from thinking about different components that can determine bargaining power and autonomy like this, another thing I think we need to think about is how this household bargaining interacts with other institutions. So in this work, what we did was we thought about how it interacted with the institution of marriage. Okay, in this case, we were thinking about, we had in our backdrop the South Asian marriage payments, the dowry payments, these massive payments that brides' families have to make at the time of marriage, and the extent to which they had property rights over those marriage payments is actually declining with development. So this is quite a shock, right? So we think of property rights for women increasing with development. This is something that was actually declining with development. So we tried to understand this by thinking about marriage, bargaining within the household interacted with the marriage market. And what you actually see there is, so if you improve the legal rights of women, say, their bargaining power could improve, right? They can threaten their husband more, but in fact, they become less attractive to their husbands as a result. If we think of these marriage matching, because these marriages are arranged, we're thinking of these, matching along characteristics, they actually become less attractive. So to compensate that, instead of giving the dowry payment to remain the property of the bride, they're giving it more to the groom. So they're losing property rights over the marriage payment to compensate for this. So essentially, these inefficiencies in the marriage market were the positive effects from females from strengthening legal rights was actually dampened by incorporating these marriage market consequences. So I think that, so then it also highlighted the importance of instead investing. So when parents are saving for marriage, they're either thinking, okay, I'm going to save for her dowry payment at the time of marriage, or invest in her human capital. That trade-off, actually, it would be better to invest in her human capital. Because there would actually be direct economic returns to her, and actually the groom also benefits directly from her human capital, right? So this is sort of thinking about anyway, this is just one example, but thinking about the interaction between sort of the household and these other institutions. And then, so that other work in Bangladesh showed, that really earning, and both of these two previous works shows that wage earning is one of the most crucial things if we want to think about how to compare them. But certainly there's a massive importance on property rights. So this more recent work I've done, which is in sub-Saharan Africa, where in this case, unlike the Bangladesh situation, divorce is quite common. So that threat point of leaving the household is realized a lot. So in that case, the type of property regime will shape bargaining power. So the property a woman where she can leave marriage with assets, so she has strong marital property rights, she lowers the cost of leaving the household, makes the threat of leaving more credible, more able to negotiate safe sex and less domestic violence, and made her less susceptible to HIV. So in that case, I'm actually showing that this difference in the statutory law, so common versus civil law, so in the sub-Saharan African context, common law is much worse than civil law in terms of marital property rights. And I show that female HIV rates are significantly higher due to the statutory law. So essentially, they're able to negotiate safe-sex contraception methods that protect them from contracting HIV, which also happen to be the methods you have to negotiate with your husband. So this actual work suggests that if they had sort of legal reform where the common law, the way it plays out in sub-Saharan Africa right now, were to be reformed to look more like the civil law, we would have actually 1.6 million fewer women living with HIV in that area. But then on to also, and thinking, I think Agnes brought this up, there's just more subtle parts of these negotiating with the household. So for example, this other work I did where we look at the improvement in female inheritance rights in India, we actually found this perverse result where it increased both male and female suicide rates. So it increased males by more than females, but still it increased female suicides from family problems. And we sort of see this as what happened was it increased conflict. So that process within the household is really, we think about the bargaining power, and then somehow there's an increase in bargaining power, and then we have to see this outcome. We haven't really done more than that. But the conflict that happens, that negotiation process, we have done very little work on, and this sort of highlights that we need to think more carefully about that, how that conflict actually plays out. And essentially, we'd never want to advocate reducing gender equality on the account that it increases conflict in the household, but does highlight the importance of providing help with women to seeking unhappy marriages and escape violence, and also these negative conflicts. So essentially, the men are reacting to sort of a benefit to women, and they've so what research from developed countries shows you is once the societal norm changes, so these sort of more gendered, pro-gender norm is more accepted in society, then men are less threatened and there'll be less conflict. So this is sort of a temporary situation. And then also these sort of conceptual models of how things play out in the household ignore information communication. They essentially don't ignore it, they assume it flows freely. But we have a lot of empirical and experimental evidence to the contrary. So for example, early work I did where I looked at ROSCAs and these rotating savings and credit institutions in a Kenyan slum, we saw that women were actually using these institutions to hide money from their husbands. They wanted to hide information. This has now been found in other experimental literature where women are less likely to use like an ATM account, that they think their husband could get the money out. And also we know from a lot of experimental literature now too that women behave very differently if the man's present or not. Okay, so ability and willingness to conceal information is a critical element to understanding these household decisions. And then finally, I just want to end on not really necessarily household empowerment in the household, but what I think is something where we need to head, and work I'm involved with, thanks to GROW and IRDC. So essentially, amongst economists, so not as much the focus of the RCT guys, but the economists that think more about the big picture and sort of why some countries are rich and some countries poor, have really come to the consensus that a big part of the variation is explained by successful political institutions and variation in political institutions. And from a policy perspective, if we want to scale up any of all this RCT work we've been doing, we have to involve political actors in that. There's no way they can be scaled up without that. So it seems to me that to move forward in the positive effects of economic growth, in turn enhancing female empowerment, a crucial ingredient has to be women's roles in these political institutions. I think, as already mentioned yesterday, we know very much that with any of these advances we've made in terms of economics and so forth, the political participation of women is absolutely the worst by far, and has increased the lowest. And what little work we do know, so on the female from economics anyway, I'm not as familiar with other disciplines, is the female political representation, even at the very local level, does have effects. We've shown it to, like the household results where we think women invest more in education, you can see it at the public good level, improves aspirations and accomplishments of women, and this is related to the mentoring issues that have been already brought up in this, in this conference. And we think it shows females' access to the justice system and so forth improves. But all of this wisdom comes from India, essentially, where we've been able to estimate. And I think this research is very incomplete throughout the developing world, but in particular Africa. And I think Africa is a very interesting point to study because, unlike many places of the world, there are a lot of traditional there are a lot of ethnic groups that had allowed women in traditional positions of power. And I think that is not studied at all. And there's a massive variation with this as well in terms of not only their female autonomy, as we saw in those other indicators, but also their political participation. So this is what we've been doing. We've been trying to put this together. But just to emphasize again, this massive variation across the continent. And the thing is that often people, I think maybe things have changed, but when we first studied female autonomy, people thought of, things are really bad in Asia and South Asia. Africa is not so bad because women are allowed to earn plots of land. They can earn an independent income, and these sort of really biased sort of, I don't know if you are familiar with this concept of missing women, but these extreme gender biases we were seeing at birth or investment in children, people sort of said, well, they don't really happen in Africa. And I don't think that's the case. Certainly the data don't show this, so this is just basic whether these basic autonomy measures of what husband's decision-making power and whether they're justified in beating. You can see massive variation just across the 4 broad regions of sub-Saharan Africa. And likewise, I've done work on computing these missing women that Amartya Sen found in India and China. And if you actually move away from his overall broad sex ratios and instead look at mortality rates by age, you actually find a massive amount of excess female mortality in Africa and varying across regions. So this is a country level variation. This is 0 to 14. So these are women that are dying prematurely, supposedly due to gender discrimination at between 0 to 14. And then this is between 15 to 59. So this is just a point to say there's a lot of variation, and we shouldn't be saying, Africa looks better on some of these dimensions of Asia. I mean, maybe people don't think that anymore. That's certainly what people were thinking a while ago. So anyway, together with, thanks to GROW and IRDC, we're essentially want to look at this variation in these sort of autonomy and empowerment issues and the role that this traditional female power in Africa has. And I think sort of understanding this deep-rooted, so why were women allowed in positions of, these are sort of pre-colonial even measures of why women were allowed in these political institutions, why that was the case, and then how that plays out today will inform how we can think about the interplay between political institutions, economic development, and gender equity. Okay, thank you.
So thank you to our panelists for three very thought-provoking talks there. So the organizers were very wise in expecting that we would be a little bit over time. So we've got plenty of time for discussion. They allotted a lot of time for lunch, apparently. So that's wonderful. So don't feel rushed. I think what we can do now is open it up to the floor, and maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and I could just moderate. Sure. So maybe we'll start with the person with the mic for efficiency, and then go here and here.
Thank you for very interesting presentations. I'd just like to bring to the conversation another reality that wasn't really touched on. I work in Peru, so I know mostly Latin America. And there I would suggest that a critical issue is teen pregnancy and lone mothers. Because I was struck by the importance that was given to, of course, negotiations within the household between wife and husband. But I would suggest that we also need to take into consideration the reality of many countries in Latin America, in particular, where men abandon their partners. Or don't acknowledge that they're fathers of children, and that's a real issue. I mean, it's not necessarily better for women to be lone mothers. In fact, many statistics show that they're worse off in comparative terms. So I would suggest that the issue, the question of early marriage in particular needs to be very much contextualized because in many societies the problem is not whether they get married or at what age maybe they get married, but whether they initiate their sexuality early and in what context, what kind of problem arises. And a very clear cause of early pregnancy is sexual violence in Latin America. It's a serious issue that is starting to emerge in public discussion. But I think that we need to consider that also as a crucial problem that in turn is related also to different configurations of households, because what happens is that many women who become mothers continue to live with their parents for a long time, or also women that become mothers start living with their parents, how do you say that, parents-in-law, and then the father disappears, but they stay with their, with the family of the father. So all kinds of negotiations that happen in a very unequal position for women that is not only between husbands and wives, I think need to be brought in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe we'll take 1 or 2 more and then allow the panel to answer. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, so I think there's one question over here.
Thank you all for your presentations. My question is for Dr. Quisumbing. I'm trying to understand this idea of jointness, and I wanted to ask, when you're thinking of jointness in the context of the WEA, or even more generally, is there a separation between spousal jointness in terms of ownership of major or minor assets and a generational jointness, especially when it could be for major assets or minor assets, but I'm thinking more on the major asset side. So can we think of the separation, or how does that figure in your discussion of jointness? Thank you.
I think there's one more question here.
Thank you for the very interesting conversation we are having. I'd like to intervene on the research on Africa. And I would like to sort of recall that Africa is changing at a very rapid pace. And I'm not very sure research is capturing the change going on. First of all, we have to know that Africa has a very young population. Age between 18 and 35-year-old represent 70%. So if you're not capturing what is going on in that age group, you're missing the boat. And many of the fundings sort of is related to older women, married women. So that is a call for sort of taking on board that reality. Second of all, Africa is very diverse. So the word Africa doesn't mean much when you do research. You have to break it down to even going down to countries, and when you go to countries, you might go to cultures. Let me talk about my country, which is Senegal, one of the highest rate of female representation in parliament, 48%. Thanks to a law, but thanks also of a vibrant civil society organization, etc. And many progress happening with many challenges also. I'll talk about it this afternoon. But if you sort of want to, bring research as sort of a tools to trigger change, you need to capture that. Otherwise, and that's what the young people are telling us, that whatever you're doing is sort of in a traditional way, but you're not sort of, capturing our own reality. When you talk about HIV, for instance, even in West Africa, it's so diverse. Senegal is, under 0.3% of HIV. So if you relate it to what you said, it's quite different. So my call is to capture the emerging change as researchers, and sort of also, so I would encourage partnering with researchers in Africa that are sort of, on the ground and capturing those realities. So let's not sort of put it in Africa as one reality. It's thousands of realities. It's so different. And when you talk about international development, it's very important to bring that diversity. Otherwise, you miss the boat. That's just a, sort of a word of caution I would like to bring in this debate. Thank you.
Let's take one more, and then I think we'll pause for some responses.
I wanted to ask, why did Sen miss out on excess female mortality in Africa? I mean, he must have had access to the same sort of data that you're looking at. So it's interesting that, you're capturing this. And I also remember maybe in the 1990s, there was this paper by Peter Svedberg, that showed that if there was nutritional bias within households in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the bias was against boys rather than girls. So I'm trying to fit together this interesting sort of, statistics that you're showing us.
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll open it up to the panel.
I can address the teen pregnancy question. This is a very relevant one. Susanna and I were talking about this yesterday. Certainly the data that I was speaking from are not meant to be representative globally or even of their countries. They're from a very purposive sample that's qualitative. But I think that it speaks to the broader issue of change within adolescent populations, and one that's being recognized by interventions that are more commonly now focused on that early adolescent phase, the 10 to 14-year-olds, because by the time we get to those later stages, a lot of these decisions have been made, these processes have been initiated. I think as far as the pregnancy specifically, we're in the decision-making panel, so to put it in the context of decision-making, beyond the fact that there was or wasn't a pregnancy, understanding the pathways that fed into that, I think are going to be critical for informing how to both address the existence of that pregnancy and the support thereafter of those women based on their social supports and how those have transitioned within their societies. Thank you.
I'll I'll deal with the question on, is this on? Okay, on jointness. So I think that's a really interesting question because especially in societies where you have intergenerationally extended households and where you have ownership or control of assets, not only between husband and wife, but also between parents, typically of the husband, or siblings of the husband. And I think that in terms of data gathering, it's not that difficult because you can put in your questionnaire codes for, controlled by other members, other household members, or whatever, and you can ID that. But I think it's what is, I think, less studied is how this affects bargaining power within those intergenerationally extended families. And I think, so I can't speak to this. I'm going to draw from some work that some of my colleagues are doing. So like Ruth Meinzendick, who is a sociologist, is looking at how empowerment changes over the life cycle, and they're doing a study in Nepal as part also of the GAP project. And what they're seeing is that because a daughter-in-law is typically a very junior member of the household, she becomes empowered when the household splits, and then she becomes independent of her mother-in-law. And there is apparently a tendency for when households can afford it, when the couple can afford it, they split from the house, they split from the paternal household. But I mean, I think it's an interesting thing and something to look at, certainly.
Yeah, so just regarding the Africa comment, certainly I fully agree. I don't at all mean to group Africa just as one, and I think it's uninformative, and the research that I've actually done and I'm doing is all at the ethnic group level, it's not at the country level. But I fully think that, I think that's a valid criticism of how people have spoken about it. That's sort of partly why I mentioned the South Asia versus Africa. People have sort of generalized women in Africa can own plots of land and so forth, and we have no idea how persuasive that is, who it exactly applies to and so forth. And these are just based on a few papers that make a big impact in research, and I actually think it's very understudied, and we actually don't know, and I think it's very well taken, your point. And also, I think it is a very good point that a younger population is determining things, and maybe pre-marriage is very important for autonomy, and that's not, people aren't thinking about that actually much. I mean, I think a lot of RCTs are now in terms of when they give information and so forth, but I think that's a very valid point. So yeah, I take it very well. With regards to SEN, so partly why we're finding such different results is SEN relied on overall sex ratios in the population, whereas we moved to mortality rates by age group. And the reason sub-Saharan Africa was overlooked is because when you look at overall sex ratios, in fact, African ethnicities, and you see this in the US data as well, they actually, relative to everyone else in the world, are more likely to have a girl at birth. So everywhere the natural sex ratio of birth is biased in favor of boys, whereas it's still biased in favor of boys, but it's significantly lower among African ethnicities, and this is throughout Africa, it's amongst African Americans. It's been noticed in the US Census data for 200 years. So essentially, when you look at the overall sex ratios, that masks the problem. And that's why he wasn't finding them in Africa. And then I know so there's less work showing that there's biases against against girls in the African context, but again, I think it's just very limited number of studies. We don't know yet. Relative to all the work done in South Asia on this topic, there's like a handful of papers. So I think it's just up to investigation still, yeah.
So I know there were still some persistent questions, so I think we have time for another round, so we'll start here, and I see a hand here. Those two for now.
Thank you. I really found your presentations interesting, and my question is for both Siwan and Lotus, but I've observed over the course of yesterday and today that not one discussion of women's empowerment has not also spoken of intimate partner violence, and I'm observing or wondering like that we speak of threat points in bargaining power and in women's empowerment, and that male violence is in fact a threat point being exercised by males to disempower within the household. And should we not, so two questions, should we not in any set of measures about women's empowerment also be measuring intimate partner violence or violence, gender-based violence, because it disempowers? And then the other question for Lotus is, in jointness, I'm curious about, like when power is negotiated, is there less violence observed? Is there less interpersonal, intimate partner violence?
Okay, and the second question was over here.
Hi, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for such interesting presentations. Sorry, over here. So this is another one for Dr. Quisumbing on this issue of joint ownership. You talked about it being murky and within households having both cooperation and conflict. In the past, I've worked with agricultural co-ops in Peru and Tanzania, and I see great potential for the cooperative model because within the system, the people who own the land have the membership cards, go to the meeting, vote, participate in decision-making, and typically these are men. So women who are responsible for the bulk of the agricultural production have no access to the decision-making fora. But the question I have is how do you, within a joint model, how would you control, or how would you facilitate controls for women? So an example I think of is in Tanzania, interviewing coffee farmers. The women were primarily responsible for collecting the coffee and maintaining the trees. The men took the coffee and sold it and had the membership cards and went to the cooperative meetings. And the women took care of alternative crops like bananas. But they told me that when the price for bananas went up, the men took the bananas and brought them to market. So how would you begin to account for that?
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I actually didn't understand the question. So there's something about how we measure it could actually disempower them? No.
Just that if we're looking at sorry, so I work at Global Affairs Canada, and we're looking at coming up with indicators for measuring implementation of our policy. And when we look at indicators around, and part of our policy is very clear, it's not about not just gender equality, but women, the empowerment of women and girls. So if we're going to measure women's empowerment, I think because violence is a disempowering force, it disempowers, that we need to be measuring it also. And when we look, for instance, at like the global gender gap as a set of measures that's commonly used, there's no measure. I mean, women's political participation, women's health, health, education, and sorry, there's 4 measures. But violence, disempowerment is not being measured, and violence is disempowering.
Yeah, for sure. But I actually think it is being measured. So just in the sense that these standard survey questions that I referred to. So one is, do you think your husband is justified in beating you under certain contexts, and then also and under many contexts? And then they also ask the men that. These are the standard sort of surveys. So you get it from both the wives and the husband's perspective. And from my experience, they're very, very correlated. There's not too much difference in opinion. And then secondly, you typically know how much violence they've experienced. So it's a matter of bringing it into these indices, because it's certainly in the data in standard surveys. Yeah.
Violence against women is one of the SDG metrics as well. It's in the demographic and health surveys, as WHO runs a violence against women survey. They have both the attitudes and actual experiences, lifetime and in the past 12 months, and they break that out by physical, sexual, emotional, or combinations thereof. It is certainly important as far as its relationship with jointness of decision-making. Violence in the data that I was presenting today, we didn't hear about it that much. These are younger adolescent girls, but overall, violence against women it's experienced in all societies, but particularly patriarchal societies, as an exhibit of power. And so the more disenfranchised women are from those decision-making processes, there tends to be increases in violence against women. We also know that as social inequities compound gender inequities, that also, I'm from a health background, so the health results are commensurately negative, as you would expect.
Before I answer your question, I want to also to address your question about why isn't it in an empowerment index. So interestingly, we're now developing a project-level Women's Empowerment Agriculture Index, and the projects themselves asked for domestic violence to be included, domestic violence as well as measures of inter-household harmony, because they see it, they witness it, they witness that domestic violence is disempowering and that it can also be an unintended consequence of some programming. So it is going to be included in the new index. I wasn't sure whether your question was how to measure jointness better or how, in a programming context, would you facilitate more jointness and, okay. So there are a number of ways, I think, depending on the project. So in some projects, relaxing membership rules so that households can have 2 members who participate in trainings, for example, is one way that at least information can be given to both the man and the woman. The membership rule can also hold for things which are not necessarily related to training, such as membership in local organizations. But one thing that I thought was quite interesting is, so as part of the work we're doing on these nutrition-sensitive agriculture programs, we actually asked husband and wife separately whether they had ever heard of things like negotiation skills. Have they ever heard that, it's good to talk about, to discuss things? And so a lot of them actually have not. They have not been exposed to programs which try to improve inter-household communication. So that is one of the things that Helen Keller International, who is our partner in a number of our impact evaluation, is doing. They're trying to facilitate both community conversations as well as conversations between husbands and wives and also important family members. So they have a series of role-playing games which are actually quite interesting.
Thank you. One more question right here.
Some other researchers here, like Susanna, have researched issues of how standardized DHS questions about decision-making are not uniformly understood, and also that having too much decision-making power could actually be disempowering because it's sort of an overload of responsibilities. Can you speak to how any of these nuances have maybe come up in your own research, or any sort of context-specific or demographic-specific nuances have come out as well? Thank you.
This is a total non sequitur, but it's very important to me. Has anyone found my cell phone? It has a red case. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll take this one here. So, are there any other remaining questions? We're getting pretty close to the break. Okay. Oh, did I miss one?
Okay, I can answer that particular question. So, yes, questions not being well understood. It's like every researcher is like, they didn't get my question. So there is actually a systematic process which a lot of, I think, psychologists and other people, not economists, do, which is called cognitive interviewing, where they have a systematic way of assessing whether respondents really get what the questionnaire is trying to ask. So there's a whole literature on that. And we have actually used that in revising the WEA, and it sort of shamed us that we didn't do it in the first place. So we now do it all the time. The question about, is there too much decision-making power, like spare me making a decision about what we're going to eat for dinner? We do have this question in the recent version where we ask this question, who makes a decision on X, Y, Z? And if you could decide, would you want to be making this decision? I think it's important to ask whether they actually want to be making this decision or not.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. So I would argue that the decision-making questions, as currently asked, do you decide alone, jointly, someone else, are actually measuring the implementation of decision-making and not decision-making power. Decision-making power, I think, would instead be to say, do you want to make a decision about this? Did you get to, and did you achieve what that desire was? And that's not a bevy of questions that we have in most surveys right now, so I completely agree.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks again to the panelists.